You were never free. You were just alone, and you have known this for a very long time, even if you have never said it out loud. You came home to an empty house, you unlocked the door yourself, poured yourself a bowl of cereal, and sat in front of the television, waiting for the sound of a car in the driveway. The culture looks back at that era and calls it freedom. You built an entire adult identity around the belief that you did not need anyone, and you told the world and yourself that you turned out fine. But Carl Jung understood that the psyche cannot be tricked by cultural nostalgia. The fierce self-reliance you protect so violently is not just your greatest strength. It is the architectural footprint of a childhood where nobody was coming to save you, and what you built on top of that silence, the persona, the independence, the armor you never asked to wear, has a precise psychological name and a cost that no one in your life has ever accurately described to you. Until now, you were not given independence. You were given an empty space and told to call it a kingdom. You look back at your childhood now, and the version you tell people sounds almost enviable. You rode your bike until the streetlights came on. You took care of yourself. Your parents trusted you. You had freedom that kids today will never know. But when you hold that memory a little closer, when you stop narrating it as a story of strength and just look at what was actually there, the picture changes. That trust was the byproduct of parents who were divorced, or working double shifts, or medicated, or simply not present in any way that a child's nervous system could register as safety. You did not learn to self-regulate because you were gifted. You learned to self-regulate because there was no one available to regulate you. Jung saw this mechanism clearly. He warned that a certain kind of behavior is forced on people by the world, and professional people endeavor to come up to these expectations. But the danger, he said, is that they become identical with their personas. You built a persona of complete self-sufficiency before you were 10 years old, not because you were precocious, because the adults around you were unavailable, and a child who cannot rely on the adults in the room will construct an internal architecture that makes reliance unnecessary. That is not resilience. That is a premature ego structure built in the absence of a parental container, and then reinforced every single year for the next 4 decades by a culture that called it strength. The independence you brag about at dinner parties was your desperate 9-year-old attempt to parent yourself, and you did it so well that everyone, including you, forgot there was ever a wound underneath it. But the way your brain adapted to that unsupervised quiet created a specific physiological capacity that you've been carrying ever since, without ever being told what it actually is. Because a child left alone with unpredictable adults does not just become quiet. They become hyper-perceptive. You possess an uncanny ability to read the energy of a room the second you walk into it. You know exactly what kind of mood your partner is in before they speak a single word. You can sense when someone is about to erupt, when a conversation is about to turn, when the silence at the dinner table means something different than it meant 5 minutes ago. People have called you an empath for years. They frame it as a spiritual gift, something rare and luminous, as if you were born with a frequency other people cannot access. Jung traced this capacity to its actual origin. He wrote that the psychological condition of the child is so intimately connected with the psychological attitude of the parents that the children are driven to live out what the parents have repressed. He called it participation mystique. A young person exists in a state of unconscious identity with the environment. When that environment is safe, they develop at a natural pace. When it is threatening or erratic or simply hollow, their perception differentiates years ahead of schedule. The intuitive and feeling functions sharpen into instruments of detection. Because in a household where the adults are volatile or absent, reading the atmospheric pressure of the room is not a talent. It is a survival requirement. You did not learn to read rooms because you are an angel. You learned to read rooms because missing a subtle shift in your mother's voice or misreading the weight of your father's footsteps on the stairs used to mean something dangerous. Your nervous system calibrated itself to track micro-expressions, tonal shifts, the space between words, and the quality of silence. because those were the only data points available to a 9-year-old who had no adult interpreter standing between them and the chaos. That is the origin of what you call your empathy. It is real. The capacity is genuine, but it was forged in a furnace you did not choose, and the exhaustion you feel in crowded rooms, the way you cannot simply relax at a party without tracking every microshift in every face. That is the cost of a gift that was never a gift at all. It was a trauma adaptation, refined by decades of use, mistaken for a personality trait. And decades later, this exact radar system is responsible for the strange, heavy feeling you get when you look at old photographs. The culture encourages you to look back at that time with fondness, but your body is telling a completely different story. You watch a documentary set in the 1970s, or you hear a specific song on the radio, one you have not heard in 30 years, and something drops into your stomach. It is not warm, it aches. It sits on your chest like a physical weight, and you call it nostalgia because you have never been given a more accurate word. Jung warned about exactly this mechanism. He wrote that in the neurosis is hidden one's worst enemy and best friend, that the illness, the symptom, the weight you carry is not a meaningless burden. It is your own self, the other whom, from childish laziness or fear or for some other reason, you are always seeking to exclude from your life. The nostalgia is a projection. What remains unconscious gets cast outward onto images, songs, eras, objects. The intense feeling you experience when you see footage of a 1970s kitchen, or a wood-paneled station wagon, or a child riding a bicycle down a tree-lined street at dusk, is not a longing for the past. It is the buried shadow reaching up through the only crack it can find. The grief that was never processed, for wounds that were never acknowledged by the people who caused them, attaches itself to imagery that resembles the scene of the original wound. And because the imagery looks golden and warm, you mistake the grief for fondness. You are not missing your childhood. You are grieving the fact that you never actually got to have one. The era was real. The songs were real. The long summer evenings were real. But the child in those memories was alone, and no one noticed. And the grief of that fact has been sitting in your chest for 40 years, disguised as a sentimental ache. What happens when you refuse to process this grief is the part Jung considered the most insidious. Because if you do not name the wound, you will spend the rest of your adult life secretly performing for the people who inflicted it. The alchemist's path was written for exactly this moment. The moment you realize the grief you have been calling nostalgia has a structure, a Jungian name, and a way through that does not require you to abandon the strength you built on top of it. Jung-based boundary drills, perception training for empaths, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. 236 pages, downloadable now at thesurrealmind.com. You are in your 50s now, maybe your 60s. You have a career that functions, a home that is paid for, a life that from the outside looks like proof that everything worked out. You still deal with your family of origin, or what remains of it, and you still play the role that was assigned to you before you had language. The strong one, the one who handled it, the one who does not complain. You bite your tongue at Thanksgiving. You let the revisionist history stand. You hear your siblings or your parents describe the past as if it were an adventure, and you say nothing, because the cost of correcting the record has always felt higher than the cost of swallowing it. Jung named this trap with devastating accuracy. The mask you built at 9 years old was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to get you through, but you wore it so long and so well that it grafted itself onto your face, and now you cannot tell where the mask ends and where you begin. Your refusal to complain is not strength. It is a lingering bid for approval from people who never provided it in the first place. You are still, at 57, at 63, performing the role of the child who did not need anything, because admitting that you did need something, that you needed it desperately and it was not there, would shatter the narrative that has held your identity together for your entire adult life. And this is the part that stings. You are not performing for strangers. You are still performing for the ghosts of your parents, trying to prove to people who may no longer even be alive that you did not need them. And the ferocity with which you protect that performance proves exactly how much you still do. But breaking this performance requires looking directly at the bodies left behind in the wreckage, because the story your generation tells itself relies on a massive, collective blind spot. When people of your generation gather and talk about how tough you all were, how you were built different, how you could handle things that would break kids today, there is something you do that nobody else in the room seems to do. You quietly count the ones who did not make it. The friend from the neighborhood who started drinking at 14 and never stopped. The sibling who shattered so completely that the family simply reclassified them as the problem child and moved on. The abuse that went entirely undetected, not because it was hidden, but because no adult was watching closely enough to see it. The overdoses. The car crashes at 17. The quiet disappearances that everyone agreed not to mention. Jung wrote that the development of personality is at once a charisma and a curse, because its first fruit is the conscious and unavoidable segregation of the single individual from the undifferentiated and unconscious herd. To individuate, to become psychologically whole, requires separating from the collective narrative. And the collective narrative of your generation is that the absence was a feature, not a wound. That the lack of supervision produced character, that everyone came through it whole. Naming the casualties is not a betrayal of your generation. It is the first requirement of psychological maturity. Because turning out fine was a lottery, and the ticket price was paid by children who had no say in the matter. Some of them are sitting in this room, still carrying the weight. Some of them are not here at all. Acknowledging this darkness brings you to the final, necessary paradox of your adult life. You do not have to give up your independence. You do not have to pathologize your peace, the stillness you have built around yourself, the sovereignty of your solitude, the life you constructed after you walked away from the house that made you. None of that is a lie. Jungian psychology does not ask you to collapse your identity into a victim narrative. It does not ask you to trade one persona for another, exchanging "I turned out fine" for "I was damaged." Both of those are masks. Both of them flatten you into a single story. What Jung called the transcendent function is the capacity to hold two seemingly opposed truths at the exact same time, without forcing one to cancel the other out. He described it as the production and unfolding of the original, potential wholeness, something more honest than a resolution and more durable than a cure, a revelation of the essential self that contains both the wound and the strength that grew around it. You say, "I freed myself at 18. And the grief and the relief arrive in the same breath. You must hold both. Your solitude is a trauma response. It was built from absence, from the empty hallway and the television and the cereal bowl and the key on the counter and the long hours when nobody was coming. That is true, and you have never been wrong to sense it. And your solitude is a genuine, earned, sovereign strength. The fortress you constructed out of that void is real. It is yours. You survived the unmothered and unfathered void, and you did not just survive it. You built something inside that void that belongs to no one but you. The child who came home to an empty house and unlocked the door with their own key was never free. They were alone, and the aloneness carved a space inside them that nothing has ever been able to fill, and nothing has ever been able to take away. You were never free then. You were given absence and told it was trust. You were given silence and told it was independence. You were given a room with no one in it and told it was yours to do with as you pleased, when what you actually needed was someone to be in that room with you. But the solitude that was forced upon you then is the exact mechanism that guarantees your absolute freedom now. Not because the wound was worth it, not because suffering builds character, because you, specifically, took what was absent and made it into architecture. And the architecture held. You turned out fine, everyone says so. But the word you have been looking for, the word that actually fits the weight of what you did and what it cost you, is not fine. It is individuation. If this video names something you have been carrying for decades without a word for it, leave a comment below. I read them. And if there is someone in your life who still says they turned out fine, but whose voice catches every time they say it, send them this video. Not as advice, as recognition. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you will turn the recognition you felt in this video into a practice you can live by. Jung-based boundary drills, perception training exercises, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind. 236 pages, beautifully designed, downloadable now. Start your training today at thesurrealmind.com.